Hi everybody. Okay, this is my second video on the book Plague, and it's by Dr. Judith Mikovits and Kent. Oh gosh, how am I? Heaven Lively, Heckin' Lively, something like that. And the now we're going to read the foreword. The note from Dr. Mikovits was about the book. I read that yesterday. That took almost a half hour. I don't like these videos to be longer than a half hour. And the foreword looks like it's going to be pretty long too. This is by Hillary Johnson, and they call the foreword a disease able to affect the economies of nations. Oh, aren't we very aware of how diseases can affect economies right now? Hers, yeah, I'm going to start reading. Hers was the last presentation of the day, and the moderator allowed a final question. I raised my hand. Is it true that you have discovered a novel pathogen in this disease? I had heard a rumor, but my expectations couldn't have been lower. Silence ensued while Judy Mikovits gripped the sides of the podium as if weighing her options. Yes, she finally said. There was scattered laughter in the hall, as if she had just made a joke, only an audience of people who have been ill for a very long time and who have even the slightest knowledge of the fraught history of their disease could be so devoid of hope that such a claim could be considered laughable. It's not a new pathogen, Mikovits pressed on, suddenly lowering her voice to a degree barely audible, but it is new to this disease. We have so every time I start, I gotta yawn. We have submitted a paper to Science, she added, on that intriguing scientific riddle, the annual scientific conference held by the UK charity Invest in Me at One Birdcage Walk near London's House of Parliament ended. It was May of 2009. My friendship and professional relationship with Judy Mikovits began. She could not have imagined the inferno she was about to enter, the ups and downs and startling turns of which are described in this book. I would watch and listen in sympathy over the next 3 years as Mikovits, challenged and derided by critics in a way few scientists will ever experience, seemed to leap from one circle of hell to another. Ultimately, her crime would emerge as heresy, a sub rosa charge reserved for anyone who dared offer evidence for a viral cause, and worse, transmissibility, in a disease governments on every continent had for 3 decades effectively disappeared with a contradictory melange of explanations, none of them logical. That kind of is an important thing. That it sounds logical, reasonable, common sense, you can understand. Makes sense? With her pending publication still undergoing editing, Mikovits was about to lead a battle charge in what has often been described as medicine's holy war. But then the 11-syllable myalgic encephalo oh, here we go again. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, understandably shorthanded to ME, has never been regarded as an ordinary disease, nor has the public health response to it been anywhere near normal. Instead, it's been saddled with an extraordinary burden of meaning, a word Susan Sontag employed in her famous essays, illness as metaphor. Nothing is more punitive than to give a disease meaning, that meaning invariably being a moralistic one. Sontag wrote, any important disease whose casualty is murky and for which treatment is ineffectual tends to be awash in insignificance. Since its emergence in the late 1970s in pandemic form, ME has been touted as a psychiatric affliction of people with poor coping strategies or histories of unachievable ambition, as one American government scientist wrote in an influential paper in 1988. Ultimately, any hypothesis regarding the cause of ME, the myalgic encephalomyelitis, must incorporate the psychopathology that accompanies it and in some cases precedes it. He added, aided by a passive lay press, government scientists have sought to dismiss the disease by labeling sufferers with all manners of deficiencies and malevolent motives. That list has included malingering and cheating welfare systems. And this is the chronic fatigue syndrome, is what they're really talking about. Being either sympathy seekers or type A personalities who one day simply fell apart, or people who read about the disease and wanted to have it. The Centers for Disease Control probably wins any contest as to which U.S. government entity has done more to trash victims and belittle the disease. CDC has trotted out hysteria, yuppie burnout, a genetically linked inability to handle stress, a history of childhood sexual molestations, doctors working themselves into a frenzy, collusion between patients and doctors, and an epidemic of diagnoses, to name a few of the untenable causes handed down from on high over the past 30 years. I kind of like that one definition called, the patient is feeling whatever the patient says they're feeling. Any collective memory of just how suddenly and aggressively this disease emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s, especially in large coastal cities like New York, Boston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, recedes with each passing year. Anyone born after, say, 1985 or 1990 will be unable to recall a period in their own lives when this scourge was virtually unknown. Yet by the mid-1980s, distressed doctors and desperate patients had turned the disease into the top category of inquiry at both the Centers for Disease Control and public health departments in the major cities of this country. Eventually, their calls both to the CDC and the NIH, National Institute of Health, exceeded queries about AIDS, autoimmunity deficiency syndrome. At the height of the AIDS epidemic, in 1988, a small group of worried scientists and research clinicians met to discuss the disease and its origins in Newport, Rhode Island. Charles Carpenter, professor of medicine at Brown University Hospital, noted, we're seeing something that wasn't there in the 50s and 60s. Most of us feel this is new. If this had been going on in the 50s and 60s, even if we had discarded it as psychiatric, it would have been written about, and it's not in the literature. And that suggests there is a dominant agent that's driving the disease. Another doctor, Paul Cheney, agreed. How could we have possibly missed this disease for all these years, he asked, although a large number of patients are subtle and may not be that sick. There are a significant number of patients who are really quite incredible. And I just can't believe the medical profession could have watched this, missed this, for decades or millennia. It's too striking. 26 years after Carpenter and Cheney voiced their concerns, current estimates place the number of sufferers worldwide at 20 million, with 1 million or more of them in the U.S., exceeding the number of patients with breast and lung cancer, AIDS, and multiple sclerosis combined. I think that's kind of significant. Today, a doctor in New York City Skypes with patients in Uzbekistan, Scotland, and Norway. Japanese, Chinese, and Latvian investigators attend medical conferences in San Francisco. ME is now the most common chronic disease most people have never heard of until they acquire it. This is again chronic fatigue syndrome. By 2009, when Mikovits appeared on the scene, ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, was a disease with a shocking history of neglect that rose to the level of government-sanctioned human rights violations perpetrated upon millions around the world. Patients were denied not merely medical care, payouts on disability claims, and the emotional support that might have been forthcoming from family and friends had they suffered from a real disease. They had been thoroughly disenfranchised and subjected to ridicule and abuse from all quarters. If they were children, they were denied educations. Adults and children were on occasion incarcerated in psychiatric institutions against their wills, a ghastly outcome resulting in at least some well-documented cases, their deaths. The spiral into years and decades of poverty that frequently accompanied onset of the disease was perhaps the most intolerable outcome of all. ME was a storm gathering on the horizon in the late 1970s, a rumored malady that sounded too incredible to believe, like mono, except you never recover, was how the disease was first described to me by a fellow journalist who had his ear to the ground. This once rare disease was about to explode in tandem with the AIDS epidemic, but those with me would share a very different fate, ME, the chronic fatigue syndrome. Rather than spend billions of dollars on research and reorder the medical research cosmos on its behalf, public health authorities would seek to disappear ME by any means available, whether by marginalizing its victims, my least favorite coping mechanism, or as documented in my book, Ostler's Web, conspiring to prevent congressionally mandated research on it. Well, I like congressionally mandated research on it better than I like marginalizing victims. There's a magnificent treatise waiting to be penned about the divergent paths taken by governments of great nations as regards AIDS and ME, so thinly separated as to symptoms and aberrant biological signs. Both diseases have as hallmarks a deranged immune system that allows a myriad viral infections to propagate, viruses that normally would remain latent, an elevated cancer risk, dementia, and more. As long ago as 1986, a top neurologist was unable to differentiate the two diseases while studying MRI brain scans of ME patients pocked with multiple small lesions and reduced gray matter, and those of patients with AIDS-related dementia, or ARD. Patients suffered from a devastating cascade of symptoms, rendering them ghosts of the people they once were. More than half become completely disabled, a quarter permanently bedbound. Recovery is rare. Morbidity studies have demonstrated that ME patients are as ill as end-stage AIDS sufferers, advanced cancer patients, and people dying from congestive heart failure. Well, my goodness, of course they're tired. If their immune system is fighting a myriad of viral infections, how can you possibly feel energy? Do you know how tired out you feel when you're sick? If the immune system is fighting multiple viruses at one time, how can you possibly have any energy? And if this goes on for any length of time, that would have a cumulative effect, is what I would think. But I'm just being a common person. With her publication in Science the following October, Mikovits would provide highly persuasive evidence for an AIDS-like viral infection existing in close to 70% of patients and 4% of healthy controls. The virus was called XMRV and had been discovered at the University of California in 2006. A member of the gamma retrovirus family, XMRV was classified as murine leukemia virus, one which likely had jumped from its natural reservoir of mice to humans at some juncture in the recent past. Although XMRV's discovery had aroused little fanfare, Mikovits' data, drawing an association between the virus and ME, or chronic wasting syndrome, rare immune cancers, and eventually autism, raised a firestorm 3 years later. If her data were right, then 10 million people in America alone were infected, but asymptomatic, with this virus. At one juncture during the ensuing scientific fracas, an incredulous vice president of the American Red Cross, Roger Dodd, dubbed Mikovits' findings the doomsday scenario. In other words, it was too horrible to be true. That's a little scary. A media-stoked controversy erupted as laboratories around the world sought to replicate the findings in ME patients, a drama that played out over the next 3 years with a kind of fury rarely seen in science. Famous scientists shouted over each other's presentations during normally staged conferences. I hate that. That is the most ineffectual way to share ideas. They're too caught up in their own pride. Relationships shattered and paranoia blossomed, revealing scientists to be not atypical of the rest of humanity. That I agree with. Publications as diverse as The Economist and Science News followed the story faithfully and with bemused interest, as if the often down and dirty dash to confirm or deny was a tennis match instead of a pressing scientific matter, the outcome of which had the potential to affect the economies of nations. One highly conservative estimate of the annual loss to the U.S. economy from ME was $20 billion, a figure based on the unreasonable assumption that everyone disabled by the disease had been earning just $20,000 a year when they fell ill. Given the history of the long politicized disease at the center of the controversy, the uproar was hardly surprising. I think a lot of times these scientists, they're very intelligent. They're geniuses. They're very, very, very intelligent people. And they usually come from small communities where they shine like a star. And then when they're all put together in the same room and they actually have to compete about somebody of the same caliber, they're not used to that. And pride gets in their way sometimes. That's my personal opinion. Yet the baseball hat and flip-flop wearing scientist at the center of the controversy, who bragged of her shared ancestry with Attila the Hun, was a surprise. She was 46, with oftentimes unkept, sun-streaked hair and wide, innocent-looking blue eyes. She looked like she would be happiest at the helm of a sailboat in some far reaches of the Pacific Ocean. I can get into that. In reality, she was a molecular biologist and a biochemist, and the author of approximately 50 publications on the immunology of HIV, its cancers, and the chemistry of drugs, excuse me, to fight its infections. I should say coronavirus. A 22-year veteran of the National Cancer Institute, she had been mentored in her early years by Frank Ruscetti in his lab at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Ruscetti was himself a veteran of Robert Gallo's brutally competitive AIDS lab. I'm just going to take their word for that because I don't know. Perhaps understandably, sufferers of this disease felt that, with the materialization of Mikovits and her collaborators, especially Ruscetti, co-discoverer of the first human retrovirus in 1980, the grown-ups had arrived. Certainly Mikovits was not and would never be among the beleaguered ME clinicians and researchers of past decades, a stalwart of tiny fraternity in perpetual need of funds, well known to each other and to patients. Yeah, that is sad. I mean, they literally have to compete and win grants in order to be able to do these studies. I don't think that's in our best interest. Since the early 1980s, the latter had existed as if in some kind of dystopian parallel universe, in possession of information they deemed urgent, but in which few besides themselves were interested. A constant at their scientific conferences were the ashen-faced patients, mostly women, lying in fetal positions on the carpeted corridors outside the hotel ballrooms, blankets pulled up to their necks. Somehow they had made their way there, but the effort cost them everything. That's a little bit of exploitation, if you ask me. Certainly there was little doubt that Mikovits was a different kind of scientist, one who didn't seek the approval of the top guns at the NIH, National Institute of Health, and who wasn't afraid to upbraid scientists at the CDC, Center for Disease Control, whether via email or in person. Indeed, she had a quality of fierceness rarely seen in science. She would call it XMRV, the biggest epidemic in United States history, one destined to turn the U.S. into the equivalent of HIV-riddled sub-Sahara Africa, if it continued unabated. She labeled the Centers for Disease Control criminal for what she saw as the agency's failure to control the spread of XMRV, Inside her lab, the Atlanta agency's acronym stood for Can't, Don't Care. CDC. Can't, Don't Care. Sad. She and her staff derided the agency's method of selecting patients by random telephone surveys, calling the government's cohort Publishers Clearinghouse patients. Judy Mikovits was unshakable in her convictions and harsh on her critics, whom she considered biased, occasionally dishonest, and often ill-informed. She was a charming advocate of patients. Startlingly, for a scientist, she even consorted with them. Oh, heaven forbid! Seeking them out! Oh my gosh. And befriending them! Now that's gotta be against the rules. Once posting her personal email address prominently to the blogosphere, her rationale was not just humane but utterly reasonable. Her understanding of this disease arose from patients and their histories, and she formulated hypotheses for scientific experiments based on what she heard and observed. In other words, she was studying her subjects. The ancient Greeks would have lauded Mikovits for her methods, but in the 21st century, oh, she was an oddball. She still is in the 22nd. As far as other scientists were concerned, perhaps her greatest sin was her public conjecture about what her data might imply for other unsolved diseases, especially autism, a malady that vied with ME as a biopolitical hot button. She had identified family clusters in which parents and other close adult relatives suffered from ME, and children suffered from autism, and found evidence of gamma retrovirus infection in victims of both diseases. It was one thing to pose scientific hypotheses about controversial disorders over drinks at the conference hotel bar with lab colleagues, but to explain in some detail such hypotheses on daytime television, talk shows, or to journalists from major American newspapers, as Mikovits did, was another matter. Federal scientists who frequently confused their mandate to perform research with a mandate to prevent public panic were especially unnerved by the use of words like infection and transmission in the same sentence with words like autism or lymphoma, and certainly in conjunction with what the CDC calls, in preference to ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. Of course, it's a rare and delicate venture in science to be first, and few hazard the risk. Mikovits' primary science collaborator and unabashed admirer, Rossetti, said of Mikovits, "What I always try to teach her is learn the scientific method and learn it well so that you can publish something that 99% of the scientific community might say you are wrong, but which you know is right." That's right. If you know you followed all the rules to the letter and still came up with that conclusion, there's no doubt. That is the courage of a true scientist, and Judy has that. Perhaps it's unsurprising that for the next 3 years, Mikovits stood unbowed at the center of crackling scientific storm that raged over several continents. If she was correct, and a highly infectious retrovirus was in fact the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome, and 10 million Americans were already infected, well, that not only changed the geometry, but shattered the credibility of the nation's bulwark against infectious disease, the CDC, and its more prestigious sister agency, the National Institutes of Health. By year 3, pondering the 5'5" Mikovits and her place in the scientific cosmos brought to mind Abraham Lincoln's purported remark to Harriet Beecher Stowe, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Oh my. I didn't know he told her that. Oh my. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Abraham Lincoln. Mikovits had been so insulated in what could be called the HIV/AIDS research bubble, she had never heard of ME until being enlisted as scientific director of a new institute affiliated with the University of Nevada in Reno. What drew her to such a foolhardy fate? A rush of intuition, facts lining up with facts, her knowledge of AIDS and immunology, a eureka moment. I spent my whole life working on this. I just didn't know it, she would say later. In 2006, she sat in the audience at a conference in Barcelona and listened to a veteran of the ME wars, a doctor who had seen thousands of patients and had learned about the disease in real time, right along with them, talk about a group of 300 patients he had followed for years. Dan Peterson of Nevada, an internal medicine specialist with a wait list measured in years, described what Mikovits would call opportunistic infections in these patients, multiple immune deficiency, a kind of subacute encephalopathy that lowered IQ and destroyed even the brightest patient's ability to think straight, complemented by abnormal brain scans using several technologies. The doctor offered data for cytokine storms. Oh, this sounds kind of like Alzheimer's too, doesn't it? It's my opinion. Don't confuse it with this book. An onslaught of inflammatory proteins like interferon that leveled victims, generated in response to infections. He noted that 5% of patients in this carefully observed group had rare immune system cancers that would be expected to occur in the general population at rates closer to 0.02%. In all, 77 of the 300 had either blood cancers or cellular changes that were predictive of lymphoma. Mikovits was struck to her core. It's a retrovirus, she thought, almost saying the words out loud. HIV was one of 3 retrovirus families known to infect humans. Maybe there were 4, Mikovits wondered. Long known to infect domestic animals such as cats and cattle, as well as wild animals, retroviruses caused cancer, immune deficiency, and horrendous neurodegenerative diseases. There's lots of those. If the disease Peterson described wasn't AIDS, it was akin to AIDS, or as Mikovits would say eventually, the other AIDS, or non-HIV AIDS. She leapt to the microphone when Peterson finished. I'm a cancer researcher, she said. Number 1, I look for viruses in cancer, and number 2, this smells like a virus. 3 years later, having met hundreds of sufferers on both sides of the Atlantic, she would comment, it's amazing to me that anyone could look at these patients and not see that this is an infectious disease that ruins lives. There is an immense backstory to Mikovits' contemporary story, a heartrending tale of dashed scientific careers and broken-hearted people who have made important seeming discoveries about ME and ended up on the sidelines, incredulous that their work went unheralded, and more importantly, unfunded. There's that competition for those grants coming in. Not infrequently, those discoveries were evidence for retroviral infection. Experts familiar with the clinical manifestations of the disease have recognized retroviruses as a class of pathogens with the power to cause all the symptoms and outcomes they document: immune deficiency, neurodegenerative disease, and greatly elevated rates of cancer. One reads again and again and again that the cause of the disease is elusive and the disease itself mysterious. Implicit in these cliches is that some organized, concerted effort has been undertaken to solve the mystery, to no avail. Contrary to popular belief, however, searches for a causative infectious agent in the disease have been rare, limited in scope, and for the most part, either poorly funded or virtually unfunded. As long ago as the early 1980s, Campbell Murdoch, a local doctor in Dunedin, New Zealand, began referring patients to University of Otago microbiologist and medical doctor Michael Holmes, a dark-haired, enthusiastic, and open-minded young scientist whose appearance and temperament were compared by his colleagues to Henry VIII. Interestingly, the disease was popular in Dunedin as poor man's AIDS. The South Island of New Zealand was hit by the malady by the late 1970s, perhaps most famously in the small town Tapanui. I'm not sure how to say it. Tapanui? Tapanui. Tapanui. A village less than 2 hours inland from coastal Dunedin. Locals there adopted the mellifluous name Tapanui flu. Holmes, whose primary interest was clinical immunovirology, spent several years prior to his retirement in 2002 studying poor man's AIDS for evidence of retroviruses. And the Tapanui flu reminds me of right now they're saying the Wuhan flu or the Kung flu or, the Wuhan coronavirus. It's because it came from that area. That's where it first appeared. And that's very common in medicine that they do that. People get so caught up in this racist and you're being a racist and you're homophobic, Asiaphobic, whatever. No, this is how it's done. It's been done for years. Get used to it. Get educated. In 1986, using the equivalent of $690 given to him by patients, Holmes looked at 6 sufferers and 6 healthy controls and discovered reverse transcriptase, an enzyme used by retroviruses in the replication process. Because it's an RNA replicating virus, even I know that transcriptase and reverse transcriptase is needed in an RNA replicating virus. In 4 of 6 patients, in addition, he found cells with convoluted nuclei comparable to those described in the ARC, age-related complex syndrome. These were not present in controls. Just wait, I have to check on my dog. It sounded like she just fell over from a snore. Well, whatever happened, it woke her up and she's looking around. If you can hear her snoring in the background, yes, that's just a tiny little 15-pound dog. I know, it sounds like my husband, but he's not here. Oh, we would like to propose a retrovirus etiology for chronic fatigue syndrome based not only on this pilot study, but on the train of deductive observation which led us to consider it in the first place, Holmes wrote. Part of that deductive observation had been the cytokine interferon, seen in extremely high levels of ME patients. The most powerful interferon inducers are retroviruses, Holmes added. 2 years later, Holmes was awarded $7,000 from patients. Ooh, we may have found an impartial, unbiased resource for funding patients. To continue the hunt, this time with 20 patients. Again, he saw the convoluted nuclei, also seen in HIV disease. 4 years later, he had scrounged enough money to investigate another 20 patients with similar results. By then, 1991, American immunologist Elaine DeFreitas had published her own discovery of retroviral gene sequences in 80% of adult and child ME sufferers and in 4% of controls. Unfortunately, DeFreitas had been, in Holmes' memorable words, savaged and thrown to the wolves. I'm thinking some egos maybe entered the picture there. As a direct result, in his opinion, Holmes' interesting research reached a dead end with the scientific establishment in New Zealand and the rest of the world. After Holmes presented his findings at an ME conference in 1994 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the only study on causality, they're looking for the cause, out of 60 presentations, a CDC epidemiologist, Kijai Fukuda, who today is Assistant Director General for Health Security and Environment to the World Health Organization, told me matter-of-factly to talk about the etiologies as to raise false hopes. It will not be Agent X causing disease Y. New words. World Health Organization. Bought and paid for. Probably by corporations. You know, we had the military-industrial complex. Well, now we have the corporate global industrial complex. And I don't like it. Fukuda's comments were representative of the denialist mindset the peppery, often sardonic de Freitas encountered at the CDC when, after her discovery was reported in Newsweek and several major newspapers, scientists in Atlanta approached her. De Freitas, who was a fast-rising star at the Y-Star Institute in Philadelphia and had been mentored by his world-famous director, Hilary Kaprowski, commanded about as much respect from the male retrovirologists at CDC as did the patients whose blood she was studying. In defiance of protocol, they refused to follow her methods at every turn. They refused to investigate it. Ignoring her prescription against freezing blood, scientists froze ME blood samples in order to take vacation. Oh, how convenient. Selfish. Professional snobs. Big egos. Don't deny a big ego their vacation. They employed chemical reagents De Freitas had warned against. They cast aside reagents she recommended. They regarded the ratios of particular nutrients De Freitas used to nurture her cell cultures and the virus as unimportant. There's always enough time to do it wrong, but never enough time to do it right. De Freitas noted at the time. She also said, presciently, if a plague were to hit this country, the CDC would be the last to know. Can't. Don't care. No wonder they put that in the office. Eventually, De Freitas urged the agency to send a scientist to her lab in Philadelphia to work side by side with her. Yes, hello, when investigating a scientist's investigation and their results, you kind of need to follow exactly what they did to see how they got to that conclusion. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. This is gross negligence. Eventually, De Freitas urged the agency to send a scientist to her lab in Philadelphia to work side by side with her. She would bring the horses to water and hope they would drink. Y-Star director Kaprowski offered the Institute's luxurious corporate apartment to the CDC scientist as lodging, citing a lack of money to pay the round-trip airfare of a scientist from Atlanta. CDC administrators refused both invitations. That's how much the U.S. government either didn't care or did not want to know of what De Freitas had found in victims of this rapidly spreading disease. The CDC is culpable, Mikovits told me during one conversation about De Freitas' discovery. They let an entire generation become infected. I think they all know there's a huge class action lawsuit here. Yeah, but don't worry. I mean, they can only settle for what, $250,000 per victim? They had ceilings put on that long time ago. Long time ago. Oh my goodness. Which is another thing that raises eyebrows. What? By the time the CDC officials published their failure to confirm De Freitas' finding in not just one but 4 publications, and had written a letter to her boss suggesting she be fired, academic scientists were comparing De Freitas to Joan of Arc. She had dared propose an infectious etiology for ME. She had dared to turn it into a real disease. I always thought a comparison with the mythological Cassandra more appropriate. De Frida's then 75-year-old boss, Kaprowski, was a Polish immigrant of the 1930s and considered by many to be personally responsible for the European brain drain of the 1950s, during which scientists left Europe in droves for America. Many of them found a home at the Wistar Institute, because scientists know that only in a free society can ideas grow and flourish and produce results. And that's the truth.